I want to store employee and department information inside of a SQL Server database, and to access SQL Server, I'll be using the Entity Framework version 5. If I look at the list of installed packages in a brand new ASP.NET MVC4 Internet application, I will see Entity Framework was added to this project by default. This is version 5 of the Entity Framework, currently in pre-release, but that should be finalized soon. And I want to access the SQL Server through the Entity Framework using this abstraction that I defined earlier, iDepartment Data Source. That will give me access to employees and will give me access to departments. And I just noticed that this property name is wrong. I shouldn't be naming this type. I should be naming this employees. So I'll make that quick correction and do a build to make sure everything compiles. And then, since I need this interface definition in my web project, I will add a reference to that project. So right-click, add reference, go to the reference manager, select emanager.domain, click OK, and now emanager domain is a reference in my web application, and that means I should have access to that type. Let me create a folder in the web application called infrastructure. This is where I will put all of the real data access code that talks to SQL Server through the Entity Framework, and it's inside of here where I will add a class, and let's call it Department DB. I want Department DB to be derived from an Entity Framework base class called DB Context that takes care of all the data access stuff that I need. I never have to worry about a SQL connection or SQL parameter or anything like that. And I also want it to implement the iDepartment data source interface that I defined earlier, because I don't want my controllers to know about Department DB directly. I want them to do data access through this interface definition. That just makes the controllers a little more testable. We're not going to go into the unit tests in this module, but also makes them a little more decoupled and flexible. For the Entity Framework to access my employee information, I will need to define properties of type dbSet. dbSet is a type defined by the Entity Framework. It basically derives from iQueryable and iEnumerable ultimately. But we'll have those there so the Entity Framework can get to employees and departments. dbSet also provides functionality for adding and removing employees and departments. The next thing I'll do is implement this iDepartment data source interface, because it defined employees and departments also, but it defined them as type iQueryable of employee. What I can do is I can tell Visual Studio to explicitly implement this interface. That gives me a version of employees that returns iQueryable, that satisfies the contract for iDepartment data source. And when someone calls the employees property through that interface definition, I can just return employees the dbSet type. And let's do that for employees. Let's do that for departments. And believe it or not, this is almost everything that I need to be able to start accessing SQL Server. In fact, this is just about everything that I need to create a database in SQL Server, because the Entity Framework version 5 has what we call code-based migrations, where it can simply look at your DB context class, see what DB sets are available, look at the definition of employee, look at the definition of department, and generate a SQL Server schema from those type definitions. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to open up the Package Manager console, so the NuGet Package Manager console. Make sure my web project is selected, and tell the Entity Framework that I want to enable migrations in this project. What this will do is create a migrations folder for me in Solution Explorer and add a class called configuration.cs. That's what we see on the screen here. And I'm going to enable a feature known as automatic migrations. Automatic migrations are great when you're a solo developer or working on a small team or just getting started on a project. Essentially what they allow you to do is quickly make changes to your database and keep it in sync with what is in your code without adding any additional code into your solution. If you're in a situation where you need a little more process or you have a DBA involved, you might not be able to use automatic migrations, but they're going to suit our purposes just great. I'll show you how the migrations work here in just a second, but I'll also tell you right now that when a migration runs, that is when you create a database from your C# type definitions, or you change your C# classes and you need to make schema adjustments to accommodate those changes, there is a seed method on this configuration class that can run each and every time that happens. And seed allows you to initially populate the database with some information. So every application typically has some sort of lookup table or multiple lookup tables that contain static data, things like a list of countries or a list of postal codes. It's the seed method where you can make sure your database is initially set up with that information. And let's say that I initially want to seed the database with some departments, just to make sure they're in there right from the very beginning. Then I can say context.departments.add or update. This is a method that you really only use during the seeding phase of a migration. It tells the entity framework, take this department and either add it immediately, or if it already exists, then update it. Since we do not know what the ID of a department is at this point, SQL Server is going to manage those IDs. Then I can tell the entity framework to look at the name property of a department. And if it doesn't find that name, then add a department. If it does find the name, then update it. So let's create some departments. I want a department for engineering. I want a department, I guess we could have a sales department. If we have sales, then maybe we also need a shipping department. And of course, every company needs the good old human resources department. So now, every time I make a change to the database, a schema change to the database, or create a database with the entity framework, it should make sure that those 4 departments exist in the database. Let's create the database. I'll go back to the Package Manager console. And now I can type update database. And you might say, well, which database? Well, the entity framework will use some conventions to go out, and if it doesn't find a database by a particular name, it's just going to create it. And you can see here that it automatically applied a migration to it. That migration should have had all the DDL statements needed to create tables and foreign key relationships and primary keys to store my departments and my employees. And where does it go? By default, in Visual Studio 2010, it would look for SQL Server Express running. And it would just go up to SQL Express on the local machine and create a database that has the same name as your DB context derived class. So if my DB context derived class is called Department DB, I should find that database in SQL Express. In Visual Studio 2012, it's a very similar story, but by default, the entity framework will use LocalDB. LocalDB is the new version of SQL Express, and it will place the database in a folder called App Data. I'll go here in Solution Explorer and say, show me all files. Now I can see that there's a Department DB database in this folder, so that matches the name, including the namespace of my DB context derived class. I can actually double click that to open it up in Server Explorer. And if I go into tables, I can see there's departments and there's employees. My employees have an ID column, a name column, a department ID, foreign key column. All of that was just created based on my C# type definitions. The entity framework looked at them, figured out what sort of database it would need to store that information. Now, if I want a little more control over where this database is created, what server it's going to, what the name of the database is, I can just tell the entity framework to use a particular connection string. And that's actually something I'm going to do right now. I'm going to delete this database. Make sure that it's removed from app data. And then in my Department DB class, I'm going to add a constructor. When it calls the base class constructor of DB context, one of the parameters I can pass here is an explicit connection string or the name of a connection string. So I'm going to tell it to use default connection. Because if I look in web.config, a default connection has already been created for me by the new MVC4 project template. Default connection in Visual Studio 2012 will just go to localDB. It will create a database called emanager.web. In fact, let's fix this up a little bit. So it's just emanager.web. .web is the database name in a file that is the data directory. And I can also modify this name also. I could say this should be emanager.mdf. And I wanted to make all these changes because this default connection string is going to be used both by me and my department DB to access employees and departments. But later we will add the ability to let a user log in and register and restrict some of these features to only admins. I want that membership and role information to also be stored in the same database, and ASP.NET has features that will automatically do that for me, but they will need to know the name of a connection string to reach a database. So now everything is in place, or if I do a build, we're still building, and if I open up the package manager again, I should be able to come out and do an update database. And this time let me add the -verbose flag, and that will show you all of the commands that are being sent to SQL Server. There you can see there are indexes being created, tables being added, and also a table called migration history that will contain all of the information about migrations that have operated on this database. And with that in place, let's go into app data again, and let's show all files and do a refresh to see we now have emanager.mdf, just like I specified in the connection string. And if I open that up, again, we have departments, we have employees. Employees have all the right properties. I can show the data that's in the department table, and hopefully we'll find our 4 departments that we created during the seed method. And there we have engineering, sales, shipping, and human resources. Great. Now let's see if we can get that information into a browser.